Okay, so think about it for a second, right? Like how much of what we do every single day lives online now?
Yeah.
From managing our money and keeping track of our photos to just staying connected with people. It really kind of hits you how crucial it is to keep all of that stuff safe.
Mm,
And for anyone out there who's maybe looking at switching careers or exploring new paths, that really translates into some pretty big opportunities in the cybersecurity world.
absolutely.
I think, we all kind of know cybersecurity is important, but it can feel like this massive, almost intimidating field to break into, especially if you're starting from scratch. So that's exactly what we're going to try to break down today.
Exactly. And that's exactly who this deep dive is designed for. If you've been thinking about maybe getting into cybersecurity but feeling a bit lost about where to even begin, we're here to help. We've taken a beginner's guide to this whole world of cybersecurity and really distilled it down to those core elements that you need to know to get a good, solid starting point.
Yeah. I think the key here is actionable, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to just throw a bunch of information at you and leave you feeling even more overwhelmed.
Mm.
We want you to walk away with a clear sense of, okay, here's where I can actually start.
Exactly.
So the guide that we're using really tries to simplify all these complicated concepts. And I think it gets to the heart of what cybersecurity is all about, which is ultimately protecting our digital lives.
Absolutely.
That includes the systems that we use every day, the networks that connect everything, and, frankly, the mind-boggling amounts of data that we create and store. All of that needs to be protected from various kinds of digital attacks.
And it's not just important. I mean, we know that intuitively, but the demand is incredible.
Yeah.
We're seeing these cyber threats getting more and more sophisticated, and they're happening way more frequently than they used to. And that means that businesses, organizations, everyone's really looking for those skilled people who can keep their digital stuff safe. So if you are thinking about this as a career path, there are tons of opportunities out there right now.
Okay, so we get why it matters.
Mhm.
We get that there are jobs out there. But cybersecurity, like even the term itself, feels sort of like this one big blob. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
One of the key things our source highlights is that it's actually a super diverse field, right?
It is.
With tons of different areas that you can specialize in.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about cybersecurity is the sheer variety of different roles and specializations that fall under this umbrella.
Yeah.
It's not just one job description. There are so many different paths you can take depending on what you find interesting and the types of skills you develop.
Right.
So let's actually dive into some of these key branches that the guide points to, especially if you're just starting out and trying to figure out what's what.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's kick things off with maybe one of the most, I think, commonly known areas, which is network security. So in really basic terms, what is the main focus when we're talking about network security?
Well, at its core, network security is all about protecting an organization's entire computer network. So that means guarding against people getting in who shouldn't be there. It means preventing misuse of the network, making sure data stays confidential, and preventing any malicious modifications or people just trying to destroy things.
Right.
Think of it kind of like securing the physical boundaries of a building.
Okay.
You've got your walls, your doors, your security guards.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that, but applied to the digital world.
Right. That makes total sense. So what are some of the key things that we use, like technologies and tools, to actually make sure those digital defenses are strong?
Yeah. The guide mentions a few fundamental technologies. So firewalls, everyone's heard of firewalls.
Yeah.
They act as those crucial gatekeepers. So they're examining all the network traffic that's coming in and out, and they're controlling what's allowed based on specific security rules.
Okay.
Then we have something called intrusion detection and prevention systems. We call those IDSMs for short.
IDC SIP.
Yeah. And these systems are constantly monitoring everything that's happening on the network, and they're looking for anything suspicious. And depending on how they're set up, they can either alert someone that, hey, something fishy is going on here, or they can actually automatically block it.
Okay.
And then lastly, we have VPNs, virtual private networks. And these create secure tunnels for remote users. So if you're working from home and you need to access your company's network, a VPN can let you do that securely as if you were sitting in the office.
Right. So it encrypts all of that traffic.
Exactly.
So basically, it's about controlling who and what can get into the network and making sure that you're watching for any kind of intruders trying to sneak past those defenses.
Right. Yeah. It's about having those layers of protection in place.
Okay, cool. So what would you say is the next major area that someone who's brand new to cybersecurity should wrap their head around?
I think application security is a big one. So we talked about network security being the infrastructure, the network itself, but application security zooms in on the actual software applications that we use every day.
Right.
The programs on our computers, our phones, the stuff we access through websites.
Okay, yeah. So is the goal there to make sure that those applications themselves are secure?
Exactly.
So they're not like an easy point for attackers to exploit.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the focus is on finding and preventing those security vulnerabilities that might exist in how an application is designed, how it was developed, how it's deployed, because any one of those things could be a weakness that an attacker could potentially use to get in.
Okay.
And the guide mentions a few techniques that are commonly used here. So penetration testing, you might have heard that, called ethical hacking.
Right. Ethical hacking. Yeah.
That's basically where security professionals simulate real-world attacks against an application.
Okay.
So they're trying to find any weaknesses before the bad guys do. Then you have secure coding practices, which are all about building security into the software from the very beginning. So it's not an afterthought. It's built into the DNA of the application.
Right.
And then finally, there are vulnerability assessments, which
Yeah.
are like these systematic reviews of an application to find and prioritize any security flaws that might exist.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's really about making sure that the software itself is not like the weak link in the chain, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So let's shift gears a bit. We've got these networks, we've got these applications, but so much stuff is moving to the cloud these days.
Yeah,
It feels like a whole different ballgame when we're talking about security.
absolutely. Cloud security is absolutely crucial now because so many organizations are relying on cloud computing platforms like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and it's become really important to make sure those environments are secure.
Yeah. What are some of the specific things we need to worry about when we talk about cloud security? And what are the types of solutions that people are using?
Right. Well, the guide points to a few key areas. So identity and access management are super important.
Yep.
Making sure that only the right people and services can access those cloud resources. And then, there are always all these industry regulations and legal requirements that organizations have to comply with.
Oh, right.
And of course, protecting the data that's being stored and processed in the cloud, that's fundamental.
Right. It makes sense. It's like you're taking all those security principles that we've always been using and then figuring out, okay, how do we apply this to this whole new world of cloud computing?
Exactly. Yeah, it's adapting to that new environment.
Cool. So, we've talked about the networks, we've talked about applications, we've talked about the cloud. What about all those devices that we all use every day? Our laptops, our phones, our tablets.
Right.
How are those typically protected?
That falls under endpoint security.
Endpoint security.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it focuses on securing all those individual devices, those endpoints, that are connecting to an organization's network. And you can kind of think of those devices as being on the front lines, right?
Yeah.
Because that's often where attacks originate.
Okay.
So protecting those endpoints is really critical.
So what are some of the tools and strategies that we use for endpoint security?
The guide mentions a few things. So antivirus software, everyone's probably familiar with that. It helps detect and remove malware. But then there are more advanced solutions like EDR, endpoint detection and response, that constantly monitor those devices and can analyze what's going on to identify and respond to threats really quickly. And then device management solutions can enforce security policies across all those devices, so you've got that consistency.
So it's like each individual point of access needs to be protected. Okay, so let's talk about worst case scenario. Like, let's say despite all these layers of defense, there is a security breach. What happens then?
That's when we get into incident response and digital forensics.
Okay, that sounds intense.
Yeah, it can be. It's all about investigating what happened, figuring how to contain the damage, and then getting those systems back up and running.
So what kind of skills do you need for that? Like, what kind of person thrives in that kind of role?
Well, you definitely need some specific skills and knowledge. Threat intelligence is key, understanding how the attackers work. Malware analysis, so you can dig deep into that malicious code and figure out what it's doing. And then digital forensics is all about like collecting the evidence, figuring out the sequence of events, and trying to track down those responsible.
Wow. So it's like, you're a digital detective.
Exactly. You're piecing together the puzzle.
Right. Okay, so let's move on. You've talked about all these different layers, but let's talk about something more fundamental, controlling who gets access to what within a system.
Right. So that's where identity and access management comes in.
Okay.
We call it IAM for short.
IAM.
Yeah. It's all about making sure only the right people can access the right stuff. It's like verifying who you are and then deciding what you're allowed to do once you're in.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? Like, how do organizations control that?
The guide mentions a few key mechanisms. Authentication, which is like proving who you are. That usually involves passwords, multi-factor authentication, which adds an extra layer of security. And then there's role-based access control, where your permissions are tied to your job role. So you only get access to what you need for your specific job.
Makes sense. So it's about limiting access based on who you are and what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So the last major area that the guide talks about sounds a little bit more high level: governance, risk, and compliance. What's that all about?
Yeah, GRC. It focuses on the big picture, the organizational side of cybersecurity.
Okay.
So it's about setting those security policies and procedures, making sure everyone's following regulations, and managing those risks across the entire organization.
So it's like the overarching framework that guides everything else, all the other security efforts.
Exactly. And the guide mentions a few common compliance frameworks like ISO 27001, NIST, GDPR. These are like established standards that organizations can use to build their security practices. And GRC is particularly important for people in management roles because they need to make sure security is part of the business strategy.
Right. So it's not just a technical thing. It's like a whole business approach.
Yeah, it affects the entire organization.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone through all these different branches of cybersecurity. It's a lot to take in, especially if you're just starting out. So let's talk about, like, what's the best place to begin if you're really interested in getting into cybersecurity?
Well, the guide really stresses building a solid foundation.
Okay.
Think of it like, you're constructing a building. You can't just start with the roof. You need a strong, stable base first.
So what are those essential building blocks that someone needs to focus on?
It recommends starting with the basic principles of IT. So understanding networking concepts, how computers talk to each other, knowing about operating systems, especially Windows and Linux, because those are super common, and then having a basic understanding of databases and how data is stored and managed.
Okay.
The guide even suggests a couple of intro courses like CompTIA Security Plus and Cisco CyberOps Associate. Those are great places to start formalizing your knowledge.
So getting those IT basics down is really step one.
Absolutely.
But cybersecurity also feels like something where you need to get hands-on, right?
Yeah.
Like you need to actually do it to really understand
You
it.
need that practical experience.
What does the guide say about getting some of that hands-on experience?
The guide is a big advocate for getting practical in addition to theoretical knowledge.
Okay.
And one great way to do that is by setting up your own home lab using virtual machines, VMs.
VMs.
It's basically like having a safe space to experiment with different operating systems, security tools, network configurations, all without risking messing up your main computer.
Right. You're not going to break anything important.
Exactly. It's your own little sandboxed plan.
Okay. And what about more structured hands-on learning? Like if you want some guidance.
Yeah, there are some great online platforms for that.
Yep.
Try Hack Me and Hack the Box are both great. They offer interactive labs and challenges that let you practice a bunch of security skills. It's often gamified, so it's a really fun way to learn. And then there are also Capture the Flag competitions, CTFs, where you can test your skills against others and try to solve security puzzles.
Yeah, those are always a lot of fun. Now let's talk about certifications for a second. A lot of people who are trying to change careers are thinking, okay, I need a certification to prove I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Does the guide have any recommendations for entry-level cybersecurity certifications that can really make you stand out?
Absolutely. Certifications can be super valuable, especially when you're trying to break into a new field.
Yeah.
The guide suggests a few that are really well respected at the entry level. CompTIA Security Plus is probably the most well known. It validates your foundational knowledge and skills. Then there's Certified Ethical Hacker, CEH, which focuses on offensive security techniques, so you're learning to think like an attacker.
Right, yeah.
GIAC Security Essentials, GSCC, covers a broad range of topics and is highly regarded in the industry. And then we mentioned earlier Cisco CyberOps Associate. That's a good one for security operations.
Okay, so those certifications are a really solid way to prove what you know. What about actual technical skills?
Yeah.
Are there specific programming languages or security tools that are kind of must-haves in cybersecurity?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The guide points out a few programming languages that are really relevant and used all the time in cybersecurity. Python is probably the most versatile.
Yeah.
It's used for scripting, automation, developing tools. Bash scripting is essential if you're working in Linux environments, which are pretty common. And then PowerShell is another important one, especially if you're working with Windows systems.
Okay.
And then for tools, the guide mentions Wireshark, which is for analyzing network traffic. Metasploit, which is used for penetration testing,
Yeah.
and then Splunk, which is great for security information and event management, or SIM.
Okay.
It helps you analyze security logs and spot potential threats.
So learning some of those key programming languages and getting comfortable with those tools is a good idea.
Yeah, definitely a good foundation.
Okay. So let's say you've learned the basics, you've got some hands-on experience, maybe you've even got a certification or two. What else can you do to really build your credibility, make yourself stand out to potential employers?
Building a portfolio is crucial.
Okay.
The guide suggests documenting any security projects you work on, even if they're just personal projects.
Right.
Stuff you've done in your home lab or on those online platforms,
Okay.
and then share them publicly on platforms like GitHub.
Okay.
Contributing to open source security projects is another great way to get real world experience. And even writing blog posts about what you're learning can really showcase your understanding and passion.
Yeah, it shows that you're really engaged and you're actually doing it, not just talking about it.
Exactly. It's about showing, not just telling.
Right. And what about connecting with other people who are already working in cybersecurity? Is networking important in this field?
Networking is huge in any field, and cybersecurity is definitely no exception.
Okay.
The guide suggests joining online communities and forums, attending webinars to stay up to date. LinkedIn is great for building professional connections. And if you can, attending local meetups or CTF competitions is a fantastic way to network in person.
Yeah, you get to meet those people face to face and really learn from their experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say you've been putting in the work, learning the fundamentals, getting hands-on experience. Maybe you've got a certification. What kind of entry-level jobs should you actually be looking for?
The guide recommends looking for roles like SOC analyst, security analyst, even IT support can be a good starting point. So as SOC analyst, you're monitoring security events, responding to alerts. Security analyst is a bit broader. You might be doing vulnerability assessments, incident response. And IT support can be a stepping stone because you're getting exposure to the infrastructure and basic security concepts.
Right, and you're building those foundational skills.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on breaking into cybersecurity, what's the single most important thing for someone to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that cybersecurity is always evolving. It's not a static field.
Right.
So don't be discouraged if you run into challenges, because you will. Stay curious, keep practicing your skills, and be persistent. Learning never stops in cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
So one final thought for our listener. Think about which of those branches of cybersecurity that we talked about, network security, application security, incident response, cloud security, which one really stood out to you?
Yeah.
Because that area of interest could be a great place to start your exploration of this really fascinating and super important field. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.